At 3:47 in the afternoon on March 4th, 1944, something appeared in the skies above Berlin that made Hermann Göring's blood run cold. American P-51 Mustangs, lean, silver fighters with checkered nose markings, were circling lazily above the German capital. They had escorted a fleet of heavy bombers all the way from England. An 1,100-mile round trip that German intelligence had formally declared impossible for any single-engine fighter aircraft. Göring stared at the reports. These planes were not supposed to exist in such numbers. They were not supposed to have the range to reach Berlin. And the massive B-24 Liberators they were escorting, four-engine bombers filling the sky in formations that stretched to the horizon, were rolling off American assembly lines faster than Germany could shoot them down. From his headquarters, Göring watched the contrails carve white lines across the sky above his city. The man who had promised Hitler that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the Ruhr, who had boasted publicly that if a single bomber penetrated German airspace, you could call him Meyer, now understood something irreversible. The war was lost. Not on any battlefield in Russia or North Africa or Italy. Not because of any general strategy or any soldier's sacrifice. The war was lost because of a single factory beside a creek in Michigan, producing one fully assembled heavy bomber every 63 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week. This is the story of Willow Run, the American factory that terrified Germany more than any battlefield ever could. It is a story of impossible promises and humiliating failures, of a dying man's dream and the workers who made it real, of women who had never held a rivet gun building the most complex flying machines on Earth, and of how the production lines of Detroit delivered a defeat to Nazi Germany that no army could have achieved alone. The B-24 Liberator was not a simple machine. Designed by Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego, it was a four-engine heavy bomber with a wingspan of 110 feet and a fuselage stretching 67 feet from nose to tail. Its maximum takeoff weight exceeded 32 tons. 4 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial engines, each generating 1,200 horsepower, gave it a top speed of 290 miles per hour and a range of roughly 2,100 miles. It could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs behind its distinctive roller shutter bay doors, and was defended by 10.5 O-caliber machine guns operated by a crew of 10 men. But the numbers that mattered most for anyone thinking about mass production were different ones entirely. Each B-24 contained approximately 450,000 individual parts, held together by more than 300,000 rivets in over 500 different sizes. Every wing, every fuselage panel, every control surface had to fit together to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A bomber assembled improperly would not fly. A bomber assembled slightly improperly would fly badly, endangering the 10 men aboard and making a mockery of the mission it was supposed to carry out. Building such a machine, in the traditional way, required the precision of a watchmaker combined with the coordination of a symphony orchestra. Consolidated Aircraft, the company that designed it, was producing them at their San Diego facility at roughly 1 per day. Skilled craftsmen working largely by hand, measuring components with surveyor transits, fitting and adjusting until everything lined up. Each aircraft was essentially a custom job. The United States Army Air Forces had calculated they would need thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. At 1 bomber per day, the war would last decades. In January of 1941, a man named Charles Sorenson checked into the Hotel del Coronado in San Diego, California. Sorenson was the vice president of production at Ford Motor Company, a Danish immigrant who had arrived in America as a young man and started at Ford in 1905 as a $3 a day pattern maker. Over the next 35 years, he had risen through the company by mastering every dimension of mass production. His colleagues called him Cast Iron Charlie, a nickname Henry Ford himself had coined in recognition of Sorenson's relentless drive and his willingness to remove anyone who stood between him and efficiency. He had piercing blue eyes, the kind of face that belonged in the pictures, and an encyclopedic understanding of manufacturing that he had built working alongside Ford during the creation of the Model T assembly line, the innovation that had already changed the world once. Sorenson had been sent to San Diego to evaluate whether Ford could contribute to bomber production. He toured the consolidated factory. What he found appalled him. Planes were being built outdoors on steel fixtures under the California sun. Workers used hand tools and methods that had changed little since the Wright brothers. Engineers measured and remeasured each component because no two were exactly alike. The process was slow, skilled, meticulous, and completely incapable of scaling to meet what a world at war was going to demand. Sorenson watched a craftsman spend hours aligning a single wing rib and knew with absolute certainty that there had to be another way. That night in his hotel room, he sat down with a pencil and hotel notepaper and began to sketch. The concept that emerged was radical enough to border on heretical. Instead of building bombers one at a time in fixed positions, Ford would build them on a moving assembly line, the same method Henry Ford had used to revolutionize the automobile 3 decades earlier. The bomber would be broken into 11 major assemblies and 69 sub-assemblies, each produced on feeder lines, then merged onto a single continuous main line, moving through a factory a mile long. Workers would stay in place. The aircraft would come to them. By morning, Sorenson had drawn the complete floor plan for a factory that would build B-24 bombers the way Ford built cars. Over breakfast the next day, he showed the sketches to Edsel Bryant Ford, president of Ford Motor Company, and Henry Ford's only son. Edsel was 47, a quietly capable executive who had spent his entire career in the enormous shadow of his famous father. Where Henry was obstinate and increasingly erratic in his old age, Edsel was thoughtful, forward-thinking, and genuinely excited by new ideas. He understood that what Sorenson was proposing had never been attempted anywhere in the history of aviation. He looked at the sketches. He initialed the drawings. He told Sorenson to proceed. The aviation industry's reaction was instant and contemptuous. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation and one of the most respected figures in American aircraft manufacturing, heard about the plan and scoffed. "You cannot expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," he said. The entire industry agreed. Automobiles and aircraft were fundamentally different enterprises. The tolerances required for flight were measured in thousandths of an inch. The consequences of getting it wrong were not a car that wouldn't start. They were 10 men dead at 25,000 feet. Nobody believed Ford could pull it off. Almost nobody. Ground was broken in April of 1941 on 975 acres of Michigan farmland, roughly 25 miles west of Detroit. The land was personally owned by Henry Ford, situated near a small creek lined with willow trees that gave the site its name. 300 men with saws, axes, and bulldozers cleared 100-acre wood to make way for what would become the largest factory under a single roof on Earth. The architect was Albert Kahn, a German Jewish immigrant who had designed factories for Ford since 1903, including the Rouge River plant and the Highland Park facility. But he had never designed anything like this. When Kahn saw the completed plans, he called Willow Run the most enormous room in the history of man. The numbers were almost impossible to absorb. The main building stretched more than 3,200 feet in length, well over half a mile, and 1,280 feet across at its widest point. It enclosed 3.5 million square feet of floor space under a single roof. Standing at one end of the building, you could not clearly see the other end. The distance was simply too great. The factory was shaped like the letter L, with a 90-degree turn roughly 2/3 of the way along the assembly line. The design was partly practical. A straight extension would have encroached on the adjacent airfield, because finished bombers needed to taxi directly from the end of the line to the runway for their maiden flights. It was also partly financial. The turn kept the entire building inside one county, avoiding the higher property taxes of the neighboring jurisdiction. Henry Ford, even at 80 years old, appreciated that detail. 2 enormous turntables were installed at the bend to rotate the massive bomber fuselages as they continued toward final assembly. 2 production lines converged at the turn into a single finishing line, where completed aircraft received their final equipment before rolling toward the flight line and their first time in the air. Construction cost $47 million. The federal government contributed $200 million to the broader project, covering tooling, infrastructure, and the adjacent Willow Run airport, which was built simultaneously with 6 runways and 3 hangars capable of housing the finished bombers. Charles Lindbergh visited and recorded his impressions in his journal. He called it a Grand Canyon of the mechanized world. The factory was dedicated on October 22, 1941. The last concrete for the adjoining airfield was poured on December 4th, 3 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed what had already been an urgent project into a desperate national emergency. In all of 1942, Willow Run produced 56 complete aircraft, 56 bombers in an entire year. The promise had been a bomber an hour, one completed B-24 rolling off the line every 60 minutes, around the clock, every day of the week. The reality was barely one per week. The gap between the promise and the performance was not a setback. It was a catastrophe. The American press, which had enthusiastically reported Ford's bold claims and celebrated the arsenal of democracy, turned vicious. Newspapers that had run breathless stories about the factory now mocked it openly. Reporters coined a new nickname, playing cruelly on the pastoral name of the site. They called it Will It Run, a taunt suggesting the factory might never deliver at all. The nickname spread across the country and stuck like a wound. Willow Run became a national embarrassment for Ford Motor Company and for the American war effort alike. Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri, who chaired a special committee investigating waste and inefficiency in wartime production, visited the plant in April of 1942 and again in February of 1943. He was a plain-spoken man who had no patience for excuses. He was not impressed. He told Ford executives bluntly that he wanted finished bombers, not explanations. His committee's reports questioned whether Ford could ever deliver on its promises. The problems were real, and they compounded each other in cascading chains of failure. Ford employed 200 engineers producing 5 miles of technical drawings per day, but 10,000 of the 30,000 drawings sent from San Diego were already obsolete by the time they arrived in Michigan. Consolidated kept improving the B-24's design based on combat experience, and every modification rippled through the entire Michigan production system. Parts manufactured to old specifications had to be scrapped. Tooling had to be rebuilt. Workers had to be retrained from scratch. Worker turnover was brutal. The plant sat 35 miles west of Detroit, far from the neighborhoods where auto workers lived, with no highway or streetcar connection. Workers drove up to 100 miles round trip daily on inadequate rural roads. During 1 month in 1942, Ford hired 2,900 new workers, but 3,100 quit. The company was losing people faster than it could replace them. Housing barely existed in the rural area around the site. Thousands of workers lived in makeshift camps, travel trailers, and converted chicken coops. Some shared beds with colleagues on opposing shifts, sleeping in mattresses still warm from the previous occupant. Henry Ford himself made everything harder. At 80 years old, his mental faculties in decline, he still controlled the company, and his personal beliefs shaped its policies in damaging ways. He refused, on principle, to hire women for factory work, a restriction that eliminated half the available workforce at the precise moment every able body was needed. He remained bitterly hostile to labor unions, creating a culture of confrontation that disrupted production further. His enforcer, a former boxer named Harry Bennett, who ran Ford's notorious internal security apparatus, wielded enormous influence over the aging founder and used it to wage power struggles against Sorenson and the production team, undermining their authority and adding a layer of political dysfunction to an operation already drowning in technical problems. And the man who had championed the whole project from the beginning, who had seen the vision in those hotel notepaper sketches and initialed them over breakfast, was dying. Edsel Ford had fought his stubborn, isolationist father to get the bomber plant built. He had defended the project before Senator Truman's hostile committee while battling stomach cancer that was slowly consuming him. He also suffered from undulant fever, a debilitating bacterial infection likely contracted from unpasteurized milk served at the family's farm, a health food obsession of his father's that may ultimately have killed his son. Despite everything, Edsel continued working, trying to hold the Willow Run project together and protect his family's reputation. Edsel Bryant Ford died on May 26, 1943. He was 49 years old. He never saw Willow Run achieve the bomber-an-hour rate he had staked his name on. He never heard the criticism silenced. Many who knew him believed the relentless stress of the project, combined with his long, grinding conflict with his father and Bennett's constant undermining, had accelerated his physical deterioration and hastened his death. It was a private tragedy folded inside the larger tragedy of war. The cruelest irony was reserved for Charles Sorenson, the man who had conceived the factory on hotel notepaper, who had believed in it when the entire aviation industry laughed, was pushed out of Ford Motor Company by Harry Bennett in a final internal power struggle following Edsel's death. Sorenson was forced out in early 1944, just as Willow Run finally began to achieve the production miracle he had designed. He left after nearly 4 decades at the company, just as his greatest creation was proving every skeptic wrong. He watched from the outside as the assembly line he built turned the tide of the air war. Neither the man who dreamed it, nor the man who built it, would be there to see the dream fulfilled. At its peak, 42,000 workers filled Willow Run, laboring across 3 shifts around the clock. Roughly 12,000 of them, nearly 1/3 of the total workforce, were women. They earned the same wage as men performing the same work, 85 cents an hour. They operated rivet guns and drill presses. They read engineering blueprints. They measured tolerances to thousandths of an inch. They worked alongside men who had initially resented their presence and came, over time, to depend on their skill and dedication. Among them was a 22-year-old widow from Pulaski County, Kentucky, named Rose Will Monroe. She had moved north to Michigan with her 2 young daughters after her husband was killed in a car accident in 1942, looking for work that could support her family. Rose took a job as a riveter at Willow Run, one of thousands of women performing the skilled metalwork that held bombers together, rivet by rivet. She might have remained anonymous, one face among tens of thousands, except for a chance encounter that would write her name into history. The actor Walter Pidgeon visited the plant during a war bond tour, and his filmmakers needed a real worker to put on film. They discovered Rose Monroe working at her station on the assembly line. Her name was Rose. She was a riveter. She was young and photogenic. They cast her as the living face of Rosie the Riveter, and the real Rosie had built B-24s at Willow Run. Ford also hired workers of small stature, including former circus performers and sideshow workers, specifically to perform tasks that full-sized adults physically could not. These men and women crawled inside bomber wings and sealed fuel cells, holding backing plates and driving rivets in spaces too confined for anyone taller. They worked in claustrophobic conditions surrounded by sharp metal edges, breathing aluminum dust, performing precision work in positions that no one of average height could have reached. The plant director later said that for many of them, it was the first time in their lives they had a real job that demanded their skills rather than their strangeness. The government built an entire community around the plant to support the workforce. Willow Village grew from empty farmland into a small city. 30 dormitories for single workers, 2,500 family housing units, 1,000 trailer homes in organized rows, shops, schools, police and fire stations, and a hospital staffed with 8 doctors, 40 nurses, and a dentist, handling over 2 million medical cases across the wartime years. More than 15,000 people lived there at its peak, a functioning town that had not existed before the war began. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, worked at Willow Run as a technical consultant after the Roosevelt administration blocked him from rejoining the military because of his pre-war isolationist activities. Ford, characteristically resistant to outside pressure, gave him a position anyway. Lindbergh worked on redesigning the nose section and gun mounts and conducted acceptance flights of completed bombers coming off the line. And remarkably, despite the dangerous nature of aircraft manufacturing, heavy machinery, toxic chemicals, precision tools at speed, not a single worker fatality was recorded at Willow Run during its entire wartime operation. The transformation from disgrace to triumph began slowly, painfully, in the months following Edsel Ford's death. Ford's engineers stopped waiting for updated drawings from San Diego and began working directly with the Army Air Forces to manage their own modifications. The tooling was refined through thousands of small improvements, each one shaving seconds or minutes from the process. The workforce stabilized as housing conditions improved, and the Willow Run Expressway, one of the nation's first true freeways, built specifically to connect Detroit to the plant, eased the commuting nightmare that had driven so many workers away. The numbers began to climb. In January of 1943, Willow Run completed 37 bombers. In February, 75. In April, 146. In June, 190. What made the system truly revolutionary was not simply speed, it was method. Consolidated Aircraft had built each center wing section using a temporary framework of fixtures that had to be set up fresh for every aircraft, taking 250 man-hours to configure. Ford designed a permanent overhead jig system that reduced the reset time between aircraft to just 2 minutes. A single Ford-designed machine performed 42 precision operations to a tolerance of 2/10,000ths of an inch in 17 minutes. Parts that Consolidated had measured and fitted individually were now mass-produced at Willow Run, to specifications so exact they were interchangeable without any adjustment whatsoever, the same automotive principle that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier, now applied at last to the most complex flying machine ever built. On November 3, 1943, the factory celebrated the 1,000th finished B-24 to emerge from its doors. The mockery had gone quiet. By April of 1944, Willow Run was producing 453 aircraft in 468 working hours. Sorenson's dream, a bomber an hour, had finally, fully become reality. The critics had been wrong. The blacksmith had made the watch, and made it faster than anyone had believed possible. Then something happened that no one had planned for. On April 24th through 26th of 1944, 100 completed B-24 Liberators flew away from Willow Run Airport in just 3 days. The Army Air Forces sent word, "Slow down. We have no room to park them. Combat losses are not keeping pace with production. America was building bombers faster than the enemy could destroy them." It was a problem no one had anticipated, and it may have been the most powerful sentence of the entire war. In Berlin, the German leadership had watched American industrial mobilization with a mixture of contempt, denial, and ultimately, something closer to horror. In 1940, before the United States had even entered the war, Göring wrote confidently to Hitler, dismissing American manufacturing capacity entirely. "The Americans cannot build airplanes," he assured the Führer. "They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." The head of the Luftwaffe, the man personally responsible for German air power, believed American industry posed no serious threat. When President Roosevelt announced that America would become the arsenal of democracy, calling for production of 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, and 18 million tons of shipping, Hitler's advisors told him the numbers were propaganda, impossible figures designed to frighten the Axis into caution. In 1939, American military aircraft production had totaled fewer than 3,000 planes for the entire year. The idea that this number could increase 50-fold or more seemed beyond absurd. Göring had boasted publicly to his own Luftwaffe that no enemy bomber could reach the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. "If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring," he declared theatrically. "You may call me Meyer." He would come to regret those words deeply. As American bombers began appearing over German-occupied Europe in 1942 and over Germany itself in 1943, Göring retreated into denial. When General Adolf Galland, brilliant commander of Germany's fighter forces, reported that Allied escort fighters were reaching Hamburg in October of 1943, Göring refused to believe him. They must have been damaged and glided east from great height, he insisted. The alternative, that American factories could produce fighters with the range to escort bombers deep into Germany, was simply unacceptable to him. Albert Speer saw things with far greater clarity and far greater dread. Appointed Reich Minister of Armaments in February of 1942, precisely because German production was already falling behind, Speer studied Henry Ford's manufacturing principles and tried desperately to apply American mass production methods to German industry. He admitted reading Life magazine with growing unease, troubled by photographs of American war plants filled with women workers cheerfully riveting aircraft together. Nazi ideology had made this impossible in Germany. Women were to remain at home, fulfilling what the regime called their natural roles. As late as 1943, Germany was importing 50,000 Ukrainian women as household servants rather than mobilizing its own female population for factory work. The Reich still employed 1.3 million domestic servants in September of 1944. Few German factories even operated a night shift, while Willow Run ran 24 hours a day. Speer understood that this ideological rigidity was costing Germany the war. He simply could not overcome it. Then, on March 4, 1944, P-51 Mustangs equipped with external fuel tanks escorted American heavy bombers, many of them B-24 Liberators built at Willow Run, all the way to Berlin and back for the first time. The 1,100-mile round trip that German intelligence had declared impossible. The Mustangs arrived over the German capital with fuel to spare, drove off Luftwaffe interceptors, and returned safely to England. In his post-war interrogation, Göring described that moment in his own words. He said that when fighters actually appeared over Berlin for the first time, he knew with certainty that the eventual results would be tragic. The man who had promised, "You may call me Meyer," was now being mocked by his own people. Germans nicknamed air raid sirens Meyer's trumpets, a cruel joke at the expense of the man who had promised them the sky would stay safe. His prestige collapsed. His influence waned. He retreated into morphine addiction and denial. The B-24 Liberators built at Willow Run flew in every theatre of the war, but their strikes against German strategic targets were decisive. On August 1, 1943, 178 B-24s lifted off from airfields in Libya and flew 1,200 miles, much of it at treetop altitude to avoid radar, then attacked the Plosti oil refinery complex in Romania, the source of approximately 60% of all Axis petroleum. The crews flew in at altitudes so low that they could see the faces of the German anti-aircraft gunners shooting at them. The raid cost 53 aircraft and 310 American lives in a single afternoon. 5 medals of honor were awarded for actions during that mission, more than for any other single air action in the entire war. The courage those men showed was not something any factory could manufacture. During Big Week in February of 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched a coordinated assault on German aircraft production facilities. On February 24th, approximately 230 B-24 Liberators attacked the Messerschmitt fighter plant at Gotha, placing 98% of their bombs on target and leveling the facility. The operation destroyed German aircraft on the production lines before they could ever reach the sky, and bled the Luftwaffe of irreplaceable experienced pilots who went down defending their own factories. Albert Speer identified the Allied oil campaign, in which B-24s from Willow Run played a central role, as the single most devastating blow to the German war machine. After the first American raids on synthetic oil plants in May of 1944, Speer wrote directly to Hitler with rare, unvarnished urgency. "The enemy has struck us at one of our weakest points. If they persist this time, we will soon have no fuel production worth mentioning." His warning was not heard in time. Aviation gasoline production from German synthetic fuel plants collapsed from 175,000 tons in April of 1944 to just 30,000 tons by June, an 83% reduction in 8 weeks. Without aviation fuel, the Luftwaffe could not fly. Without diesel and gasoline, tanks and trucks could not move. By January of 1945, Speer reported to Hitler that Allied bombing had produced 35% fewer tanks, 31% fewer aircraft, and 42% fewer trucks than German factories had planned to build. His final verdict on the strategic bombing campaign was blunt. The war had been decided not on the fields of Normandy or the steppes of Russia, but in the skies above Germany, by bombers built on the assembly line at Willow Run. The consequences reached all the way to the Battle of the Bulge. Germany's Ardennes offensive was designed specifically to capture Allied fuel depots because American bombers had destroyed Germany's own synthetic fuel production. When the offensive failed, it was partly because German armoured units literally ran out of gasoline and had to abandon their vehicles where they stopped. The Luftwaffe could not provide air cover because there was no aviation fuel left to fly missions. German pilots sat in their aircraft on snow-covered airfields, while American fighter bombers destroyed German armour at will. It was the final proof of what Speer had been warning for months. The numbers tell the story of what American industrial power, built on factories like Willow Run, actually achieved. The United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war years, against Germany's 119,871. America outproduced Germany by a ratio approaching 3-to-1 across the entire war. In 1944 alone, American factories built more than 96,000 aircraft, roughly 80% of Germany's entire wartime production total, accomplished in a single year. At peak output, American factories completed approximately 1 combat aircraft every 5 minutes. Germany had entered the war with a clear production advantage. In 1939, German factories produced 8,295 military aircraft, while America produced just 2,141. By 1943, American production had reached approximately 85,000, compared to Germany's 24,807. The ratio had not merely closed, it had inverted completely to a nearly 4-to-1 American advantage. Ford Motor Company built approximately 8,685 B-24 Liberators at Willow Run, roughly half of all B-24s ever produced during the war. The B-24 remains the most produced heavy bomber in history and the most produced American military aircraft of World War II. The aircraft that critics said could never be mass-produced became the most numerous 4-engine bomber ever built. The 8th Air Force, which flew heavily from B-24 groups based in England, suffered approximately 47,000 casualties during the war, the highest casualty total of any American combat formation. These men flew aircraft built by the workers of Willow Run, carrying the fight to the heart of Nazi Germany in daylight raids that cost terribly in blood, but broke German industrial capacity and shattered the Luftwaffe's ability to defend its own skies. William Knudsen, the Danish-American executive who had left General Motors to lead government production efforts, delivered what may stand as the definitive summary of what American industrial warfare actually accomplished. We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible. The avalanche began in factories like Willow Run, where the impossible became routine. The last B-24 Liberator rolled off the Willow Run assembly line on June 28, 1945, just weeks before the war ended. Ford chose not to purchase the plant after wartime production ceased. Kaiser Frazer Corporation leased it, producing automobiles there beginning in 1946. General Motors took over in 1953 and manufactured over 82 million automatic transmissions at the site across 57 years of continuous operation before closing the plant in 2010. Demolition of most of the historic structure began in December of 2013, but not all of it. Through the efforts of preservationists and local historians, approximately 145,000 square feet of the original bomber plant was saved. This preserved section now houses the Michigan Flight Museum, located at Willow Run Airport, and contains the end of the original B-24 assembly line, including the two iconic bay doors through which Finnish bombers once taxied to the runway for their first flights. The Willow Run Expressway, built to carry wartime workers to the plant, became Interstate 94, traveled daily by millions of drivers who have no idea where it came from or what it was once built to do. Willow Run did not win the war alone. Victory demanded the courage and sacrifice of millions across dozens of nations. But what Willow Run demonstrated, what Nazi Germany failed to understand until it was already too late, was this. America's greatest weapon was not any army, navy, or air force. It was an industrial system capable of transforming 975 acres of Michigan farmland into the largest factory on Earth in less than a year, staffed by farmers and auto workers and women who had never riveted anything in their lives, and producing the most complex flying machines ever built at a rate that the world had never seen and could barely comprehend. When Göring wrote in 1940 that Americans were good for nothing but refrigerators and razor blades, he revealed a blindness that cost Germany the war. He did not see Charles Sorenson sketching factory layouts on hotel notepaper in the dark. He did not see Edsel Ford initialing those sketches over breakfast, betting everything on an impossible dream. He did not see the women learning to rivet, the highways being carved out of farmland, the engineers solving 10,000 problems to make the whole thing work. By the time he did see, by the time those P-51 Mustangs circled above Berlin and the B-24s dropped their payloads on German refineries and factories, it was far too late. The war had already been decided, not on any battlefield where soldiers faced each other with rifles and grenades. In a factory beside a creek in Michigan, where ordinary Americans had learned to build the most complex flying machines on Earth at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes. That was the American factory that terrified Germany more than any battlefield ever could. And its story endures, preserved in a museum on the very ground where the workers once built the bombers that brought the Third Reich to its knees. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like and share it. Your support helps keep stories like this one alive, stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to World War Declassified and join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. Thank you for watching and for helping preserve these stories for the generations still to come.